Bigfoot, or Snowman, is considered one of the most mysterious creatures in the world. He is a huge creature covered with thick white-colored fur, capable of surviving in the harshest climatic conditions of high mountain ranges. Legends of the Yeti have been passed down from generation to generation in the mountainous regions of the Himalayas, where these creatures are believed to reside. Bigfoot is known for its aggressiveness and cruelty. He is considered a dangerous predator, capable of attacking humans at every opportunity. Its orcan-white eyes are full of anger and bloodlust. Its sharp claws can easily dissect human flesh. It is believed that Bigfoot feeds on the meat of wild animals, as well as people who dare to invade his territory. The biography of the Yeti is full of mystery and mysteries. He is believed to be the surviving link of an ancient prehistoric man who managed to adapt to the harsh conditions of the mountainous terrain and became an incredibly strong and hardy creature. Bigfoot avoids contact with humans and prefers to stay in snowy peaks where no one can find him. An encounter with the Yeti is considered a curse, and many explorers and travelers search for its tracks, hoping to stumble upon this mysterious creature. But so far, no human has managed to catch Bigfoot or provide convincing evidence of his existence. Legends about him continue to live and scare those who doubt his reality. George was born in a small village surrounded by mountains. From a very young age, he was fascinated by their majesty and beauty. He spent every day on their slopes, studying their shapes and landscapes. One day, on one of his journeys through the mountains, George heard tales of strange and frightening creatures dwelling in the depths of the mountains. His curiosity was piqued, and he began to actively study the legends and myths associated with these creatures. He spent hours reading old manuscripts and talking to the locals to learn more. Growing up, George became more and more fascinated with exploring uncharted places and creatures. One day, during his exploration, he encountered an unusual creature, descriptions of which he found in ancient manuscripts. However, when he returned to the village and told of his encounter, no one believed him. His story was declared fiction, and many began to be skeptical. Despite the disbelief of those around him, George never stopped believing in what he saw. He continued to explore the mountains and search for traces of the mysterious creature. His persistence and courage allowed him to make friends who believed in his story and supported him in his quest. At the age of 35, George met an old man named Edward who told him an amazing story about a creature called the Yeti. Edward claimed that a friend of his, a mountain explorer, had recently returned from Mount McKinley in Alaska and claimed to have seen Bigfoot. The old man told George that his friend had described Bigfoot as a huge creature covered in thick white fur, with sharp claws and an embittered look. He claimed that the Yeti was aggressive and dangerous, but at the same time possessed some wild beauty and mystery. When old Edward began to tell me his story of his encounter with Bigfoot, I was amazed and intrigued at the same time. His words described the creature so vividly and directly that I felt as if I were on the slope of Mount McKinley, right next to this mysterious being. He described Bigfoot as a huge creature covered in thick white fur, with sharp claws and a sinister stare. His words were filled with horror and amazement, and I listened to him, holding my breath, becoming more and more immersed in the world of legends and myths with each word. I saw the old man express himself with such fear and trepidation as if he himself had come face to face with this mythical creature. Although I couldn't verify the veracity of his words, I sensed that his story held some inexplicable truth, something that made me believe in Bigfoot's existence. When Edward finished his story, I remained silent, immersed in thought. His story opened new horizons for me and made me think about the nature of the world we live in. I felt that my life would never be the same after this conversation, that my passion for mountains and exploration had found a new, even more mysterious direction. After a few moments, I turned to the old man and said, "Thank you for that story, Edward. I was ready to go in search of Bigfoot and learn the truth about this mysterious creature. Whatever lies ahead, I am ready to take up the challenge and go all the way in my quest for knowledge." For 3 months, George prepared for his trip in search of Bigfoot. He's been studying old manuscripts, studying maps of the mountainous areas where this mysterious creature could supposedly live. George had also been researching information in the library about local legends and stories related to the Yeti, so that he would be prepared for any contingencies. However, when George invited his friends to join him on this dangerous journey, they declined because of their fear of the unknown and unknowable. George was disappointed, but undaunted in his determination to continue his quest to discover the mysteries and riddles of the world. His wife, knowing his passion for mountains and exploration, always supported him. She was his support and encouragement, giving him strength and confidence in his quest. Her faith in him and his abilities was invaluable in helping him realize his dream of meeting Bigfoot. When George gathered his thoughts and decided to take the next step in his endeavor, he turned to his wife for support. His heart beat harder as he approached her and took her hand. "My dear," he began, "I know that my decision to go to Alaska in search of Bigfoot may seem crazy and dangerous. But for me, this is very important. I cannot stop halfway. I must learn the truth about the creature that has lived in my thoughts and heart for so long. You have always been my support and encouragement, and I hope you will support me on this difficult journey as well." His wife looked him straight in the eyes, and George saw a spark of understanding and love in them. She hugged him tightly and said, "Darling, I have always believed in you and your dreams. If it is truly that important for you to go in search of Bigfoot, I will support you. Just remember that I will always wait for you and believe in you. Be careful and believe in yourself. You can achieve your goal." With her words, confidence and determination rang in George's heart. He kissed his wife and boarded the train that was leaving for Alaska. His heart was filled with a mixture of excitement, fear, and hope. He knew that his encounter with Bigfoot would be full of danger and challenges, but he was up for the challenge. And as he gazed out the train window, he knew that his journey was just beginning, and he was ready for any hardship to unravel the mystery of Bigfoot and bring his discoveries to the world. After 3 days of a long and tiring trip, George finally arrived in Alaska. He checked into the cozy hotel that would be his temporary home for the duration of his search for Bigfoot. After a short rest, George decided to head outside to ask the locals about Bigfoot. It was important for him to get as much information as possible to understand where to look for this mysterious creature. He started a conversation with the first passerby, who turned out to be an old man sitting on a park bench. "Excuse me, I'd like to ask you some questions about Bigfoot," George began. However, the old man suddenly stood up and waved his hand, replying, "I don't want to hear anything about that creature. It brings misfortune and trouble. Please leave me alone." George was a little confused by this response and thought that perhaps the old man didn't want to talk about Bigfoot because of local superstitions or legends. He decided to address another group of people sitting in a cafe on the corner of the street. As they approached, George started talking about Bigfoot again, hoping to get some new information. However, when he mentioned the creature, everyone present suddenly became silent and averted their gazes. A few moments of awkward silence seemed like an eternity to George, until finally one of them broke the silence. "I'm sorry, but we can't talk about Bigfoot," the man said in a squeezed voice. "This creature brings curses and trouble. You'd better not look for him or interfere with him." George was stunned by this reaction. He didn't understand why people reacted the way they did to his questions about Bigfoot. He could see fear and underlying anxiety in the eyes of the locals. It became clear to him that he had encountered something that exceeded his understanding and knowledge of local legends and myths. Early in the morning, when the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to illuminate the mountain tops, George decided to go climbing Mount McKinley. His heart burned with the desire to see Bigfoot and uncover his secret, despite the fear and warnings of the locals. He took with him the necessary equipment, food, and water, and began his arduous climb to the top of the mountain. Step by step, he moved higher and higher, feeling strength and determination in every movement. Along the way, he encountered beautiful vistas and incredible landscapes that inspired him to keep going. But as he approached the summit, the weather began to change, becoming colder and windier. George kept going forward despite all the challenges that came his way. Mount McKinley, or Denali as the native Aleuts call it, is one of the highest mountains in the world and the highest peak in North America. Its elevation is about 6,190 meters, and its massive slopes are covered with glaciers and snow all year round. Mount McKinley is known for its harsh climate, highly unpredictable weather, and treacherous glaciers, making it one of the most dangerous places to climb. Locals and explorers have long told legends of missing people on Mount McKinley, of missing climbers and adventurers. Many stories are associated with the mysterious forces of the mountain, with dangerous conditions meeting those who bravely attempt to conquer this majestic and ruthless place. Some accounts speak of strange sounds heard on the mountain, of mysterious figures seen on the peaks and slopes. There is something mysterious and intimidating in these stories that makes people fear the mountain and respect its power. For George, Mount McKinley was not only a real challenge, but also a symbol of his passion for exploration and the search for mysteries. His encounter with Bigfoot was not only a quest to solve the mystery of this creature, but also a chance to test his strength, endurance, and determination. In every step up the mountain, he felt his inner strength and belief in himself growing stronger and stronger, making him consistent and determined. The weather began to deteriorate as we approached the summit of Mount McKinley. First, the sky was covered with dark clouds, then a heavy snowfall began, then came the wind, tearing rocks off the steep cliffs. George realized that he needed immediate shelter from the elements and decided to pitch a tent. As he lay in his tent, he left his belongings outside: an axe, special boots for climbing the mountain, and a supply of water. He felt that the weather was getting worse and more dangerous, and that every precaution had to be taken to preserve his life. However, upon waking up the next morning, George discovered that his belongings were gone. The axe, the boots, even the water supply were all gone. At first he thought the locals had done it, but then those thoughts quickly faded away. He felt that something invisible and mysterious had happened to him. George was desperate. He searched for his belongings, axe, boots, and water supply, for hours, searching every corner around his tent, but to no avail. The weather was getting worse and worse. The snowfall was intensifying, the wind whistling in his ears, worrying him even more. He realized that without these things, he would be left defenseless and vulnerable to the elements of nature. Hazy thoughts and anxieties kept him busy. He read one line from the book he had brought with him for peace of mind: "Achieve your goal by all means." This phrase seemed to cheer him up, spurring him on to new actions. And then a foolish idea was born in his head: to leave traps near the tent, put some food there, and wait until a possible thief or just a random passerby would not fall for these traps. He began to make traps from the materials he had: rope, sticks, small stones. Following that, he spread some food near the tent to attract the attention of a potential predator. And now all that was left was to wait. George sat inside his tent, watching tensely through the door as events unfolded. The hours stretched slowly. The weather didn't improve, and the wind got even stronger. George read his book, trying not to think about what was going on outside its walls. The line about reaching the target appealed to him, motivated him not to give up in the face of difficulties and to keep going. But fatigue and tension began to sap his strength. He found it hard to keep his eyes open, his mind beginning to cloud with fatigue. And then, unintentionally, he fell asleep. 4 hours passed. When he woke up, he was shocked. The traps were set, the food was out of place, but no one was around. He looked around, trying to figure out what had happened, but everything was empty and quiet. He had nothing to compare this moment of mysterious silence and emptiness to. George got up, walked out of the tent, and looked around where the traps had been set. But no trace, no food, no thief was to be found. George's gaze became filled with determination and confidence. He realized that his food and water supplies would last for days if he used them sparingly. He analyzed his resources and concluded that he had enough supplies to survive on Mount McKinley. He decided to move on forward in search of Bigfoot. Equipped to the best of his ability, George again set about climbing Mount McKinley. Step by step, he moved higher, overcoming any obstacles that came his way. The weather was still just as unpredictable, but his determination had only gotten stronger, his will tougher. He felt it was his destiny, his mission to find Bigfoot and uncover his secret. It had been several days of hard climbing, but George had no doubt that he was on the right path. He felt that he was getting closer and closer to meeting the mysterious creature he had dreamed of for so long. Each tiring step, each ordeal he endured made him stronger, more confident in his abilities. Dizziness and shortness of breath gripped George as he continued to climb Mount McKinley. Everything began to swim before his eyes. Sounds became muffled, and his strength was leaving him. He realized that it was urgent to find shelter and rest, or he might faint. And then, at the moment of unconsciousness, a cave appeared before his eyes. He realized that this was his salvation, the only place where he could rest and regain his strength. With his last efforts, he reached the entrance to the cave, crammed himself into a corner and fell, deprived of strength and consciousness. Awakening after some time, George realized that he was in a cave. A faint light shone through the narrow opening, illuminating the room and revealing its dark corners. George was grateful to fate for saving him and decided to use this time to rest and regain his strength. He made a fire from the woody debris he found in the cave, prepared hot tea from his stockpile, and tried to warm himself. Warmth enveloped him from within, taking away the cold that had penetrated his bones on the climb. His thoughts became clearer, his body found its footing, and he began to look around the cave. Slowly, George looked around the room for anything of interest. The light from the fire illuminated the walls of the cave, creating a play of light and shadow on their surface. He saw drawings carved into the stone, ancient symbols and images that reminded him of something familiar but not quite clear. With each moment, he was delving deeper into the mystery of this cave, into the history that was hidden from view. George continued to look around every corner of the cave until his gaze fell on the carved word, "Save," on the wall. A shiver ran through his body as he realized that the word had been written by the hand of someone in the same situation as he was in now. The word carried a cry for help, a plea for rescue from the danger that awaited in the cave. George realized that he was not alone in this dark and mysterious cave. He felt an invisible presence, felt that his soul was in touch with the soul of the one who had left that message on the wall. It became clear to him that this was not only a request for help, but also a warning that there was something more powerful and dangerous in this cave than he could have imagined. George realized that spending another night in the cave was the wisest and safest decision. He decided to use this time to regain his strength, inspect the entire cave once more, and prepare for the next stage of his journey. He scouted out a fire to keep the cave warm and lit, made another cup of hot tea from his supply, and settled down by the fire. He closed his eyes, focused on his breathing, and immersed himself in his thoughts. Thinking back on everything he had experienced over the past few days, George reflected on his goal of finding Bigfoot. He realized that this task was not an easy one, full of dangers and unknowns, but his determination was unrelenting. He went to sleep. Waking up was quite unusual. He was no longer lying in his sleeping bag, but hanging and as if driving. He was shaking now and then, tin cans jammed into his body with their sharp parts, and he hung in total darkness, literally clenched by his bag and the junk that filled it. There was a thought of cutting a hole in his sleeping bag with a knife, but he couldn't move an arm or a leg. George's sleeping bag was being dragged by someone large and very strong. His sniffing and grunting came to the helpless man every now and then. Had he been kidnapped by that huge, wild, hairy man his grandfather had spoken of? It was a question George had asked himself more than once, as he felt the creature being lifted with its heavy burden somewhere upward. His creepiest sensation came when George felt the sleeping bag with him hanging over some void, and he was going down as if on an elevator. Finally, the sleeping bag hit the ground. The train seemed to have arrived at the final station. His body was completely stiff. It was hard to even move. He poked his head out of the bag, taking a convulsive gulp of fresh air. It was still dark, and some inarticulate mumbling came to him. In the morning, when George poked his head out of his sleeping bag, his eyes were met with an amazing sight. In front of him stood two Yetis, huge creatures covered in thick white fur, several meters tall. Their mighty bodies expressed strength and power. Their long arms ended in sharp claws. Their eyes looked at George with curiosity and some caution. The first Bigfoot was a male. His fur was thicker and longer, and he looked determined and commanding. His ominous stare testified to his steadfastness and danger. The second Yeti was a female. Her fur was more delicate and smooth, her black eyes radiating warmth and fear. Both Yetis stood in front of George, studying him with great interest. They showed no aggression, but their mighty bodies and determined facial expressions spoke of the power and danger they carried. As George rose to his feet, his heart began to beat even faster. He stepped forward slowly, but at the same moment, the first Yeti, the male, began hissing and making muffled growling noises. His sharp claws glinted in the firelight. His eyes narrowed, and he looked even more menacing. George froze in place, feeling the tension in the air. He realized that his life now depended on how he behaved. He didn't know whether to keep moving forward or stay where he was. The second Yeti, the female, slowly stepped forward, coming closer to George. Her black eyes looked at him with curiosity and some friendliness. She made no sound like the male, but her presence was imposing and mysterious. George decided not to move or show any aggression. He stood still, carefully tracking the Yeti's every move. He felt so vulnerable and defenseless against these powerful creatures, but his resolve did not waver. The male Yeti ran toward George with a ferocious roar, his sharp claws flashing in the firelight. The male powerfully grabbed George with one hand, taking him like a toy doll, making him shriek in pain. George realized that no one would hear his screams in these distant mountains, that his fate was in the hands of this mysterious creature. The male Yeti squeezed George hard, its sharp claws digging into the human flesh, causing blood to drip. George realized that his chances of escape were diminishing by the second, that his adventure could end tragically. He closed his eyes, focused on his thoughts and his determination to survive. As the male Yeti dragged him further into the depths of the cave, George felt his body weaken, his mind filled with fear and despair. George was exhausted and hopelessly bound by the rope that Bigfoot uses as his faithful assistants. The Yeti stood in front of him, scrutinizing him as if trying to figure out who he was and why he had entered their territory. George felt fear and anxiety, but a spark of determination and hope flickered in his eyes. He knew he was facing a creature of many legends and myths, but his curiosity and desire to learn kept him from letting his hands drop. The Yeti continued to study him, looking at him with its sinister eyes. George began to look around the cave he was in with Bigfoot. He saw various objects and life signs of these mysterious creatures, which opened up more questions for him. Among the items they saw were various herbs and roots, clearly used for medicinal purposes. George assumed that the Yeti had knowledge of herbs and their medicinal properties that helped them survive in the harsh conditions of the mountains. He also saw various tools made of stone and bone, which told him that these creatures had the skill to create primitive tools for hunting and survival. In a corner of the cave, carcasses of deer and other wild animals were found, indicating that Bigfoot eat meat and hunt prey in their harsh environment. George thought that these creatures had incredible stamina and strength to deal with wild animals in the mountainous regions. He also discovered several ancient drawings on the cave walls depicting unusual symbols and images of events from the past. He tried to free himself from the ropes, but to no avail. Hunger and exhaustion began to slowly but surely overwhelm him. It seemed to him that every minute in Bigfoot's captivity was getting longer and harder. The days stretched slowly, grains of sand falling drop by drop into the hourglass, reminding him of the inexorable passage of time. His thoughts darted back and forth. He remembered his wife waiting for him at home, his passion for the mountains and exploration, his goal to find Bigfoot. He realized that he had to survive in order to return home and complete his mission. But the hunger and exhaustion became more and more overwhelming. It seemed to him that his body was no longer able to withstand such trials. There was no more food to be seen. Everything began to swim before his eyes. Everything moved and seemed unreal. And so, on the very day when George felt that he had reached the limit of his strength, that he could no longer bear this suffering, that he had surrendered to his fears and weaknesses, at that moment, a female Bigfoot appeared in front of him. Her black eyes were filled with compassion and understanding. She approached him, freed him from the ropes, and handed him a piece of meat. George took it, swallowed it with difficulty. At the same moment, he felt warmth and gratitude. He realized that this female had decided to help him, to save him from starvation and exhaustion. George came to his senses when he saw the warm fire of the campfire in front of him, and a female Bigfoot looking at him with curiosity and friendliness. He felt gratitude and peace in her eyes. realizing that she had helped him survive and come back to life. George was gradually being overtaken by fatigue and hunger. He sat tied to a rock and felt his strength waning. His head began to spin and his stomach reminded him cruelly of its empty state. Hunger was taking its toll, and George realized that he had to survive this difficult situation somehow. At that moment, a male Bigfoot entered the cave. His growls pierced the air, his sharp claws gleaming in the firelight. The Yeti approached George and began to study him as if to show him who was master in this cave. The male grabbed George by the shoulder and dragged him to the wall, tying him with a rope to a heavy rock. George felt the painful squeeze of the Yeti's sharp claws on his skin, his heart beat faster, and fear gripped him. The male Yeti continued to growl and study his prey. George realized that his life was in the hands of this powerful creature, that his future depended on his decisions. He sat tied to the rock like a prisoner, waiting to see what would happen next. But in his heart there was a spark of hope and determination not to give up, not to despair, and to fight to the end. The male Bigfoot, having finished his study, left George alone with himself and the female Bigfoot. The female approached George and quietly whispered a few words in an incomprehensible language. George realized that these creatures had some special language of communication that he could not understand. He looked at the female with wonder and some hope that she carried something kinder and friendlier than her male. The female Bigfoot began to untie the rope with which George was tied to the rock. Her movements were careful and smooth, as if she understood George's fear and anxiety. George felt a sense of relief when the rope was finally loosened and he was free from his captivity. He got to his feet, looked appreciatively at the female Bigfoot, and decided to show that he was grateful for her help. The female Bigfoot smiled at George and showed him the way out of the cave. George realized that she was suggesting that he leave this place and return to the human world. With a feeling of gratitude and respect, he followed the female Yeti, leaving this mysterious cave filled with mystery and danger. George spent several days hiking down to the village. He rested only a few hours a day. His body was exhausted. His mind was on the verge of exhaustion. Some moments he fainted, but his determination gave way only before his determination to make a discovery and prove to the world that Bigfoot existed. Each step down the mountainside seemed like an eternity to him, but he was willing to go through all the challenges to reach his goal. As he began to descend the mountain, George could feel how each step was heavy and draining. His body demanded rest, but his determination was stronger than fatigue. He knew that his mission was not yet complete, that he had to reach the village and tell the world about his encounter with Bigfoot. When he finally made it to the village, he was exhausted, his eyes reflecting exhaustion and eagerness to get his words out. He approached the rescue service, recounting his adventure, his encounter with Bigfoot, how he had been captured and allowed to leave, what he had found in the cave. But he was not believed. His words were taken as fiction, as the fantasies of a poor man lost in the mountains. He looked into their eyes, his voice shaking with emotion. He begged them to believe. He explained that his encounter with the Yeti was real, that he had seen them with his own eyes, that he had survived the trials and exhaustion in the cave. But his words died in the void. His story seemed unbelievable to those listening. He was one against all, fighting for the truth and his place in the world. But even when he was rejected and misunderstood in the village, George did not give up. His determination and perseverance were stronger than words of denial. His belief in what he had seen and experienced was his strength and support. George came to the rescuers with eyes full of a sincere, pleading look. He told them his story with such emotion in his voice that the rescuers couldn't help but believe him. He begged them to go with him to the top of the mountain to see Bigfoot and learn the truth. George explained to them that he was not forcing them to believe, but asked them to at least give him a chance to prove the truth of his words. He argued that it could give them valuable experience and knowledge of the mountains that they could use in the future. The rescuers, seeing the sincerity in George's eyes, decided to give him a chance. They were ready to verify his story and see for themselves. They climbed to the top of the mountain over the course of 5 long nights. George was full of anticipation as he told them about Bigfoot and his adventure along the way. His enthusiasm and faith were contagious, and the rescuers began to believe in his story more and more. Finally, when they reached the top, George told them to get ready. They armed themselves with glowing flashlights, cameras to record every movement and event on the mountaintop. They were ready to face Bigfoot and uncover this ancient mystery. The next few hours were filled with anticipation and tension. George and the rescuers waited at the top of the mountain for over 10 hours, but they never waited for Bigfoot to appear. Their hopes began to fade, but George was persistent and wasn't going to give up. He decided to go in search of Bigfoot in their cave lair to prove the truth of his story. George and the rescuers cautiously entered the cave, shining their flashlights into the dark corners and passageways. They felt the tension and anxiety, but their determination was stronger. Suddenly they saw writings and drawings on the wall depicting events and symbols that seemed unbelievable to them. The rescuers felt a sudden sense of faith and understanding. They began to see the Bigfoot story through George's eyes. But after 5 hours, they saw nothing but inscriptions on the rock. Everyone was very tired. Finding a place where herbs, tools, and more were hanging, there was nothing there, as if the Yeti had taken the items and left. George was desperate. Everything he believed in seemed to crumble before his eyes. He saw the rescuers begin to lose interest and doubt his story. George felt hope begin to wane in his heart. He realized that he was on the verge of losing his dream, his goal, his desire to learn the mysteries of the Yeti. He looked at the rescuers with an insistent look and said, "Please give me some more time. I'm sure we'll find Bigfoot if we just keep looking." The rescuers exchanged glances, assessing the situation. Finally, one of them said, "Okay, George, we'll give you more time, but remember, we have limited resources and we cannot continue this research indefinitely. Prove your story to us and we'll believe you." George nodded gratefully and rose to his feet in an inspired manner. George realized that his time was running out, that he had to act quickly and efficiently to hold off the rescuers. But despite his best efforts, he was still unable to find proof of Bigfoot's existence. The rescuers, seeing no confirmation of his words, decided to return home, leaving him alone on the mountain. George followed the rescuers, leaving the mountain and returning home. His heart was full of mixed feelings: disappointment, sadness, hope, and determination. He knew that his mission was not yet complete, that he must return to the mountain and prove Bigfoot's existence. His wife was waiting for him, his family believed in him, and he couldn't afford to give up. When George returned to the village after his unsuccessful search for Bigfoot, he was received with great doubt and suspicion. He was pale, haggard, and gaunt after days of exhaustion on top of the mountain. His story of his encounter with Bigfoot did not resonate with the locals, and his words were taken as a sign of mental illness. George was admitted to a local hospital under the care of doctors who decided to examine his condition. At the hospital, George underwent a medical examination and his condition was assessed as extremely emaciated and exhausted. Doctors found evidence of bruises and scratches on his body, indicating that he had had a difficult experience on the mountain. George was subjected to research and therapy to regain his strength and emotional well-being. George spent several days in the hospital recovering from his journey up the mountain. His willpower and perseverance helped him overcome his difficulties and return to health. He told the nurses and doctors about his adventure with Bigfoot, hoping that his words would find understanding and support. Even after all the trials and hardships, George did not give up or lose hope. His drive to prove the existence of Bigfoot was stronger than any doubt or denial. He knew that his adventure was real and that he had to complete his mission. His determination and perseverance were his main tools on the way to his goal.